You're listening to an audio interview from Purdue University's Center on Religion and Chinese Society. I'm Joey Marshall, a graduate student research assistant with the center, and my guest is Teresa Zimmerman-Liu, a PhD student in sociology at the University of California, San Diego. Her research interest is to study how religions change and adapt in Chinese society through contact with other cultures in the modern world. Zimmerman-Liu came to academia after a career as a professional Mandarin Chinese English translator and interpreter, and after many years as the eldest daughter-in-law in a first-generation off-the-farm Hakka family in Taiwan. You'll notice in this interview how those life experiences shaped her future research. While obtaining an MA in Asian Studies at California State University Long Beach, Zimmerman-Liu began writing a series of articles on Christianity and Chinese society, several of which were co-authored with CSULB professor Teresa Wright. Some of those articles appear in China, an international journal, Journal of Church and State, and Social Sciences and Missions. Her forthcoming article is scheduled for publication in the spring 2017 issue of the Review of Religion and Chinese Society. That article is the topic of our interview today, and it's titled From Children of the Devil to Sons of God, the Reconfiguration of Guanxi in a 20th Century Indigenous Chinese Protestant Group. Let's jump right into the beginning of the conversation. I initially wanted to know about my guest's life experiences with the local churches in China, her activity working with the late evangelist Witness Lee, and how those experiences informed her upcoming article in RRCS. Paper in particular, just talk about who you are and how you came to this project.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm a non-traditional student. My undergrad was at Georgetown from 1978 to 1982, and I studied languages and linguistics and translation. And so after I graduated, I moved to Taiwan and did intensive Chinese translation. And I was a translator for many, many years. And eventually, with the recession, the market fell out for a while, and we had 3 kids in college. And I went back to school thinking only to get a master's. So I got a master's in Asian studies, but in the process, I started working with the chair of the poli-sci department and looking at underground churches and their relationships with the state. And a lot of it was because I was in the local churches and I knew a lot of the leaders. And then I did translation at the asylum office, and a lot of my clients, even if they weren't local church Christians, were from the house churches and the non-registered Christian groups in China.
Now, throughout the course of our interview, you'll hear us refer to the local churches. And in case you didn't know, the religious group that we refer to as the local churches are a network of Christian churches founded in China due to the influence of 2 evangelists, known in English as Watchman Nee and Witness Lee. They're an important and interesting religious group in China. And one of my first questions was, how in the world did Teresa get involved with the local churches in the first place?
Let's see. I ran into them on campus my freshman year, and at that point I was newly converted from I was raised Catholic, and I was now exploring, Protestant Christianity, evangelical Christianity, and I ran into them on campus. And there was a woman who worked on campus and a professor who would sometimes take me to lunch, and one day they brought me to a Bible study, and I felt that their exposition of the Bible was more interesting and more compelling than some of what I was hearing in other groups. They talk about very deep things, even in, beginning Bible study courses. They talk about the Trinity, and they talk about other things that, it's not just come to the altar, be saved, come to the altar, be saved, which is what I was hearing in a lot of other groups. And so I started, going to their conferences and going to more of their various activities. And, over the course of college, sort of got hooked in with the church in Washington, D.C. And when I decided to go to Taiwan to learn Chinese, so when I graduated, my my degree was in Spanish literature with a German-English translation certificate. But in 1982, the only job I could get would have been for the National Security Agency, listening in on Central American dictators, and I didn't want to do that.
That doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
No. So I thought, well, I'll go to Taiwan. People from the church had connections, so I was able to, get a room with a couple in the church there who rented rooms to students, and it was real close to the National Taiwan Normal University's Mandarin Training Center. So I went and started learning Chinese. And it was when I was in Taiwan then that I was recruited by the publishing company in Taiwan, the Taiwan Gospel Book Room, because they were Witness Lee was alive at the time. He was working on his translation of the Bible, the recovery version, that was a new translation from the original Greek with footnotes. And then the Gospel Book Room in Taipei was trying to translate this into Chinese. And I attended some conference with their preliminary translation, and they had all these errors in the footnote because they didn't understand idiomatic English. And so I went up afterwards and pointed them out to one of the editors, who said, "Oh, come work with us." So I had thought I'd only go for a year to Taiwan, and I wound up getting involved with that and realizing that I needed to do a lot more study. So I took formal classes in the mornings and worked in the Gospel Book Room in the afternoons. And then I wound up getting married, and so I stayed in Taiwan for 8 years. And for the first 5 or so, I was working either part-time or full-time at the Gospel Book Room, helping with translation mainly. And
over the next few minutes, Teresa shared a lot of anecdotes about her time in the local churches and her interactions with the late Witness Lee, which were so fascinating. But unfortunately, for the sake of time, I want to move on to the meat of our interview, which is about her article in the forthcoming issue of RRCS. That article is titled "From Children of the Devil to Sons of God, the Reconfiguration of Guanxi in a 20th Century Indigenous Chinese Protestant Group." I first asked Teresa to define the concept of Guanxi and describe why it was important for her research.
Okay, well, Guanxi basically means relationship in Chinese. And in the West, our cultural tradition causes us to focus on the individual, and even going back to the Greeks, it's the individual. Society is seen as like-minded individuals coming together, and there's always this individual. There's someone who, even as part of society, it's and especially after the Enlightenment, where society is seen as individuals coming out of this state of nature into a social contract. So in the West, we have this, the liberal self. We have collections of individuals, but from the time of Confucius, the Chinese have defined themselves by their relationships. So in the Confucian context, you have the emperor and his courtiers, or the nobles. You have father and son. You have husband and wife. Older brother, younger brother, and then, friends. And you have these relationships that then you are very ritualistic. And even though, Confucianism is no longer fully practiced, this whole idea of life as a web of relationships is worked into the language, and it's worked into their worldview. And so what I found, especially, so when I got married, I married into a first-generation off-the-farm peasant family. And I lived, in a 3-generation household. When I married the eldest son, who was the second of 7 children, and I had numerous younger sisters-in-law and my younger brother-in-law who were still at home. My younger brother-in-law was in junior high the year we got married. And it's everything was about the family. So because I'm elder sister-in-law, then I have a certain status, but then I also have certain responsibilities in the family, and I could say things that, say, my younger sisters-in-law couldn't say. My elder sister-in-law, who was, already married, had a different position with the family, and you're in this web of constantly shifting relationships, and you're either at the top or the bottom. And it took me a while to learn that. And it certainly is not the way that the average American looks at the world. But then as I came back to school and started reading, theory about Chinese society and understanding things like that, I realized, oh, okay, that's kind of what I was doing. And then as I started reading studies of American Christianity, or American Protestantism, which I hadn't been involved in, I converted to Protestantism and came into the local churches. But even looking at the differences between the local churches in America among white Americans and the local churches among Chinese speakers and in Taiwan, it became obvious that this emphasis on relationship was really important to the Chinese speakers and to the people, especially in Taiwan. And this idea, so in Taiwan, and in Hong Kong, when people preach the gospel, they don't get much traction from preaching about sin and the forgiveness of sin and doing the right thing. They get a lot of traction by saying, you're a prodigal son, your heavenly Father's waiting for you, come into the family of God and enjoy the blessings of God's house. And I obviously wasn't alive in the early 20th century, but people that I talked to from the church, in the churches, who had been in Shanghai and who had been in Fuzhou under Watchman Nee's ministry also said, yeah, we tried to do what the missionaries did. We tried preaching sin, and Confucian scholars said, well, I cultivate myself well. I don't have any sin. What does Christianity have to offer me? And so what they started to do was to look for things in the Bible that appealed to the Chinese culture. And the big thing was the church is the household of God. It's the family of God. And then adapting the view. So when you're in one of these large households with several generations, the older generation who can't go out to work anymore have their right to be fed and cared for under the Confucian system, but then they also take responsibility for the young children. And they take responsibility frequently for cleaning the house and doing the light housework, so that the people in the family who are able to work can go out to work and earn money, and the people who earn money then don't see, oh, my salary's for me, but it's for the whole family. And so needs in the family get met by the combined household income, not just like how much do I earn and then taking loans. It's kind of all pooled together. And so then the church, to make the church work and to get people invested in the church's community, if you're a member of the household of God, a real child of God, and you've come out of the world, which is, filled with children of the devil, and of course these are all quotes from the Bible, then if you're raised in one of these households where relationship, where guanxi matters, where how you're connected to people matter, and where family is sort of the norm, then you look at, oh, I have a responsibility to the church. I have a responsibility to my brothers and sisters in the church in the same way that I have a responsibility to my brothers and sisters born of my flesh parents. And so by framing church in this way, then they get people committed who are working for the church just like they would be working for their own families at home. And it makes a very strong community and a very mutually supportive community. And I think that is one of the big strengths of Chinese Christianity, and part of what allow, and the local churches are not the only group that do this, although the way they do it may differ based on, what teachings they pick up. But, like the True Jesus Church and the Jesus Family, many of the indigenous Christian groups that started in the early 20th century all had Christianity framed in this extension of family, which is what scholars have identified as one of um, the main focuses of the Guanxi logic. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. And so you've described how one of the things that I appreciate the most about this article and about our conversation was the way it helped me think more broadly about what it means to be both Chinese and Christian, which can be a very complicated overlapping of identities. I actually asked Teresa to speak to this. I wanted to know, how does her research inform what it means to be both Chinese and Christian?
Um, well, it's hard because in the traditional Guanxi rituals, there are a lot of Bai, Bai veneration ceremonies, Bai, right? So, for example, my ex-father-in-law was a contractor before he retired, and anytime a new building was started, the owner of the building and the chief contractor would burn incense and pray to the various and sundry deities to protect the building project. And then there would be a big feast, and red envelopes would be exchanged. And this would cement the guanxi, the relationship between the contractor and his customer, and between the owner of the property and all the workers. And everybody would have this good feeling, so the workers would want to do a good job. And after conversion, and this is one reason that my father-in-law, who was the Atang in the story with Witness Lee, one reason he never got baptized and became an official Christian was because for his business he had to always participate in these Bai rituals, and he didn't know how to do business without them, and he couldn't imagine his world without them. And people have to renegotiate how they handle these things. So, for example, when my mother-in-law did convert, and when her mother passed away, we had to negotiate with her brothers what we would do at the funeral, because at that point, all of my mother-in-law and all of her children were Christian, and we were not going to burn incense to the casket. We were not going to kneel and kowtow. But we did, so they said, well, you can't just stand there with bowed head. So we agreed we'd all bring flower wreaths. And this is something that other members in the local churches in Taiwan had, it's kind of an institutional sort of knowledge that this is something that we can do as Christians if we have non-believing relatives who, want a big impressive ceremony for a funeral, because that gives the family face and expresses the family's filial piety to the deceased. But it was all carried out through negotiation, and even so you have to renegotiate all of your relationships and the way you handle your relationships for people who are outside the church, because you're not going to burn incense. You're not going to engage in their drinking games. Usually people, after a while in the church, wind up quitting smoking, so you're not going to be lighting cigarettes for people and things like that. And so then what do you do? And I met people. There was less problem with me because I'm white American and they expected me to be Christian. And so the fact that I was even willing to negotiate a compromise to accommodate their culture, they felt honored by it. But friends of mine who were, just born in Taiwan, who were Chinese, Some of them were disowned by their families and thrown into that bulinqing, the no contact category, because their families were so offended that they weren't going to burn incense to at their grandparents' graves, or something like that. So it definitely makes your whole way of being human. It disrupts it a lot if you're going to be a serious Christian.
Yeah, well said. I want to take the opportunity to express how much I enjoyed reading your paper, and also I really have enjoyed this conversation. That's all we have time for, unfortunately. But thank you so much for joining me in this interview.
Well, thank you, and thank you for accepting my paper. I'm glad to have it out.
This concludes our interview. To learn more about ongoing research on religion in China, visit our website at purdue.edu/crcs. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our free monthly e-newsletter.